Hello, everybody. It is I, the Solo Gamer, back again, and I have brought with me a few more bits and pieces to add to the collection I have. Adding to the list of items I had in my collection from before, I have added 4 new items to the list, and I'm going to go ahead and show them all. These are a mishmash of official Sega and third-party products. But we're going to start with one of the OG classic Sega games, and one of the games that was, alongside Sonic, one of its real claims to fame early on. Altered Beast. Now, in the arcade, this game became legend for its violent, brutal gameplay and unique features of voice integration and character transformation, which was, at the time, fairly new for when this game was released. I mean, for crying out loud, this game was 1981, which means the arcade game came out in either 1989 or 1990, depending upon how long the port process was. Wise from your grave. It's pretty well considered that one of the biggest running jokes in this game was its rather notable problems with the audio. It was also, like many games of its era, notoriously difficult. But once you reached a certain limit, you gained the power of the Beast Man and could do much more. The game was well regarded for being an exceedingly difficult but fun game nonetheless. Based, of course, on its arcade-style gameplay, it gained a reputation for being very action-oriented with a lot of unique levels. Of course, it didn't hurt that its backdrop was a very sort of Greek mythology-inspired style, but it received a well-beloved reputation for being a difficult but fun action adventure game. And like many of the contemporary games before it, it was a very clear, very obvious homage to the D&D adventures of old, and all kinds of stuff like that. Doesn't change the fact that the game was, by and large, considered one of the more difficult games of its era. But each level was a unique and distinct style to it. And it also borrowed, because it was developed, I believe, by the same team. It was developed by the Golden Axe team, I believe. It used some of the same monsters and some of the same adversaries. But it was hard. and it did have a reputation for being one of the more difficult games of its era. But it was also very well respected for being one of the best sort of straight up action brawlers of its era. And I think a lot of people respected it for being so directly and clearly inspired by where it came from. Which to me, like, I love the game, but it is a product of its era, definitely. Yeah, it's like I haven't played this game in God, it's been at least a decade, maybe 10 extra years past that. Who knows? I'm not the one to say. I just remember playing this game back in the arcade for years and years when it was the hottest game in town. No jokes. It was probably one of Sega's biggest successes at the time. But yeah, it is definitely one of the harder games in the library. And a game that I do not remember how to play. But it's still an absolute must-have for anyone getting a PlayStation series, not PlayStation, a Genesis series console, or getting the Polymega Genesis adapter. Now let's move on to another of Sega's legendary games that as well also was originally an arcade release, like this was 1989, and then would receive a Genesis release. Fantasyland Falls into Crisis. And like this was definitely Sega's attempt to like show off that they could do like three-dimensional stuff, but in truth, it is all just scrolling background. Like there is no actual 3D being involved here. It is all 2D scrolling and parallax. Which, to their credit, this was not something that Genesis was natively good at. So the fact that they managed to convert what was a feature of the arcade into the Genesis actually worked exceptionally well. Now that being said, this game also always reminds me of another game from the Nintendo era that I'm still trying to get my hands on called 3D World Runner. And if you don't know what that game was, it was an early Nintendo game that also used a 3D gimmick that could actually do like 3D effects using the glasses. But unlike that game, which was very much stuck on a ground-based plane, you were just running back and forth. This game allowed you to fly to a limited extent. Also, very good effects work on this thing. Like for its era, this game was actually very well respected for its visual effects work. Forjard. But like this is where they introduced the idea of items you cannot blow up and have to dodge. Another game very similar to this is the game series Panorama Cotton, which admittedly is one of those games that did release on the Sega and is so rare that it now commands a price of hundreds and hundreds of dollars in many places. They did release a re-release on different platforms, including the PlayStation. So it is something you can check out now if you want to. But it's a very simple game. Fly, shoot, survive. It's also naturally very difficult. Now, before we get to today's grand finale, which is a very rare game that I was lucky enough to find at my local game store, it was actually a very, very, rare find indeed, but I'll get to that. But I am always a sucker for pinball. Always have been. But when people think pinball and Sega, they think Sonic's Spinball. But it was not in any way. was not in any way. That's weird. Something up with the controller? Let's restart. See if it makes a difference. A virtual pinball. But yeah, Virtual Pinball was one of those games that was meant to be a massive pinball. But I don't think it was meant to be used with this control system. Yeah, see? It's glitching out, so... Definitely an oddball in the system, but not what I was really interested in demonstrating. This is Herzog Zwei. And Herzog was the original Herzog was released on the MSX and PC 8801 personal computers, as it says here. And it's basically like a... It's basically a sort of combat shooter game that you fly a transforming mech that functions to manage a battlefield of units in real time with the goal of destroying an enemy base. So it's a combination of a shooter and a RTS game, which makes for an interesting combination, certainly. Different maps, different layouts. You can fly around, change shape, transform into different forms, and even summon different summon different forces to do different jobs, or rush off to engage your enemy. But then if you run out of energy, you have to fall back to your base where you recharge. So it's kind of like, in a weird sense, it's kind of like Supreme Commander. Yeah, like it's definitely a weird little game. At any time, you can do different things like summon infantry or do other things, but you actually absolutely have to have the manual to understand this game. You can give it different. You can give it different instructions. You can give it different orders. But again, this is the kind of thing where the only way to play this kind of game would be to have the manual. And it's one of those examples of a great game where you can actually see the intention behind it was you can summon your mechs, deploy them en masse, and then send them out to battle the enemies. But unless you understand the game's actual control system, you're not going to make any progress. And that's one of the things about the Genesis, was that unless you actually understood the controls for the game you were playing, there wasn't really a whole lot you could do about it. Because one of the biggest things about games of this era, and Herzog Zwei is a perfect example, is Herzog Zwei is a game that uses a very limited control scheme, which you then have to understand implicitly to play the game effectively. It's not something you can pick up and play. Whereas a game like Road Rash, one of my absolute favorites, is literally a game you can pick up and play because the controls are very simple. There's gas, brake, punch. And as I mentioned in my last video, one of the biggest issues with games like Road Rash was the limited sound system on the limited sound system on this platform meant that if you wanted music or sound, you often had to pick between the two. And so if you had good music, you usually had to limit the sound output. But if you wanted good sound, the music was usually horrifically bit crushed. And if you wanted voice, oh, you better be willing to pray to the memory gods, because you were gonna be fighting for that one. So in cases like Road Rash, they chose to focus on the music, which I honestly think that was a better idea, honestly. I mean, like, just gonna say, especially lately, I've taken to really appreciating the importance of music in the gaming world. Like, I honestly believe that music, as much as I like sound effects, the two things I think that matter the most in gaming, especially in the modern era, are its musical score and its voice work. Now, don't get me wrong, sound is incredibly important, especially for ambience. A game like, a good example is Dead Space. Dead Space is a phenomenal game, but it would only be half as good without the sound work being immaculate. But that doesn't change the fact that the voice work in that game is what gives it a lot of its panache, especially in the second game. And even in the third game, as much as people dislike the third game, I'm actually a fan of it, but I do recognize and acknowledge the inherent flaws of that game. But I'll be the first to say that I think that the voice work in the third game is one of its best features, as how well they did their voice work in that game. But that doesn't change the fact that the third game is, by and large, a vastly inferior experience to the second game. And the first game, of course, is the originator, so it's kind of hard to judge it. If I had to rank them, I'd say second, first, third. But I very much prefer... Oh, shit. I very much prefer... Oh no, my bike exploded and I'm wrecked. Oh no, I lose. Yeah. And to be fair, like, this game was the early progenitor of the Road Rash franchise. But then, by the same proxy, if you wanted to play a better iteration of Road Rash, there were vastly superior games in the franchise. And I'll demonstrate. So let's dump out of here. No, it's not my Sega CD. Is it on the Saturn or the... I don't think it's on the Saturn. No, it's on the PlayStation. Yeah, I think this is where I've got it. You see Road Rash? Road Rash 3D. And see, this was actually an upgraded version of Road Rash, a vastly superior version. And the thing is, Road Rash was not a Sega exclusive. It was an EA game, Electronic Arts. Or at least what we now know as EA. Back then it was Electronic Arts, and it was a different company altogether. But no, like this, Road Rash was an EA game that they ported over to the Genesis, and then as the PlayStation era came along, they embraced CD-ROM technology wholeheartedly and went like full tilt, non-stop. So if you wanted like the authentic Road Rash experience, this was among the best options. And even, to be fair, it also had that weird, super deformed, wacky art style. Now me, I'm not a fan of this particular art style, but it was what it was. And this was also like incredibly popular at the time. I do not know why. I absolutely do not know why. It definitely had the music theme down, had the right style, had the right audio, had the whole thing for it. It also had a fairly decent... They also had a fairly decent selection of race tracks. Now it is notable that you can run some of these games with analog, and some of them you can't, which strikes me as exceptionally weird for the racing genre. But to be fair, when PlayStation first launched, when PlayStation first came out, analog wasn't a common thing. Good thing about this is you can switch back and forth between... switch back and forth between analog and regular pretty much on a whim. But yeah, this game is really just... They took the basic concept of Road Rash and just upped it as much as they could with the technology of the day. They also, thankfully, they made it a lot more forgiving. Like, you could easily, stuff that would have wrecked you in the previous game, you could now survive. But it wasn't to say it was without its difficulty. It was just like they were a little less stringent, and the game ran so much better that handling was massively improved. You get crashes easily, that kind of thing. It's still definitely a good game. And you could see where they were moving with it, but it was basically the original Road Rash 2, with just a gigantically upgraded video system and audio platform. I mean, it was CD audio. CD audio meant CD quality. But the game was good. It's still fun as hell to play. Not super difficult. And I remember there was a later version where you specifically, like, it even had a mode where it was like specifically you playing as a cop and trying to take down the street racers, which was an interesting inversion of the game, of the usual gameplay, because Typically, the cops are an adversary. But yeah, this game was another great example of how the CD-ROM era was really changing things. So much more detail, so much smoother visuals, so much more activity. The games began to really grow as a general rule. Like, this was leaps and bounds ahead of what had been before. And it was in many ways due to the CD-ROM technology. It's why the Nintendo 64 was both a massive leap forward and a horrid step back. Because on one hand, Nintendo had managed, by and large, to really push the power of that machine to its limits. But using cartridges also hobbled it, hamstringed it. Because the storage capacity of a cartridge is so much less than even the... Oh, and see, I finally wiped out. But like, the storage capacity of a cartridge is so much less than the storage capacity of a CD-ROM drive. They did the math one time, and the math said that to do Final Fantasy VII on Nintendo 64 would require somewhere between 8 to 12 cartridges, depending upon the conversion of data. Buzz off, copper. But yeah, like, there was definitely a clear delineation in concept technologically, and it was like the one side of the industry saw the opportunity to go full tilt into CD-ROM technology and embrace it, and they said, yeah, this is the future, this is where we're headed. And you also had, like, the full motion video was becoming popular. You saw tremendous and tons of different stuff happening. But yeah, it was a time, and you saw like how the industry was so rapidly changing. But then, not long after, because like this came out in 1995, and 3 years later would release Road Rash 3D, which I think this is the one with the cop mode in it. And Road Rash 3D was also, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, it allowed analog. I don't have a load state. No, I don't. This is also when EA was changing its design, changing its logos. This is what would lead to like Def Jam and Fight for New York. They embraced like the full motion video full on, the biker culture and the alternative culture full on. They went hardcore into it. And I mean, like, hey, run with what works, but Alright, so let's run a race in this so I can demonstrate the 3D game. And we can talk about how this sort of represents the shift in the end of the 2D era in truth. That's weird. You know, I realized I actually haven't played this thing in for bloody ever, so I don't even remember how the controls work. Oh. That's right. The right thumbstick is a model throttle control. So you can actually control your throttle manually by using the right thumbstick. Which, to be fair, was a unique method of controlling it. Unfortunately, it meant that hand cramps were a common problem with this game. But it did mean that if you needed to, you could slow yourself down, but not stop yourself. It also meant that your main controls for your attacks were the trigger buttons. And the game runs very smooth. This was right when they'd really started to first settle in on how to do 3D efficiently, how to make it work well. It was also the first time they really showed you how you could wreck your absolute hell out of yourself. That being said, the game was not without its flaws. Controls were a little weird, you had to get used to it. The bikes are also way more floaty in this one. So like they felt like a lot less controlled. And that did vary depending upon the bike you used, but not as much as you would think. Once you get used to it, it became pretty easy to understand. But the game runs pretty much like lightning. The audio is also very good, soundscape is great, music's solid. Not exactly the most varied collection of audio I've seen. But it's a fairly decent racer, and if you knew how, you could have a lot of fun with it. It also had plenty of funny ragdolls like that. But yeah, the game was a perfect example of where the industry was at right at this time frame. It was right when the industry had figured out how to make 3D an effective platform, but it hadn't yet figured out how to make it, what's the term, as fluid as it needed to be to make the 3D system work efficiently. And that was more to do with the game's own inherent nature than anything else. Like, yeah, see what I mean? You also notice that you and your bike have individual health bars. And then whenever you wreck, your health bar regenerates back to full, but your bike does not. Which means it's possible to both destroy yourself or your bike, as well as your opponent's bike and self, and doing either one usually nets them whatever weapon they might have been armed with. But the game is, by and large, a product of its era. and it is definitely like a challenging game in and of itself. I think personally, I think the original Road Rash was actually the better of the two, simply because its controls feel a little bit more stiff and a little bit more solid. But it feels like this was their effort to really sort of breach the gap between them, and I do feel like they were making efforts on it. But I do feel like you see a lot of what was really sort of the last resort, the last dance of the 2D era in this time frame, because you see a lot of 3D stuff hitting the road, and then you see a lot of the 2D stuff still hanging around too. But this was the era where 3D became the king, and even like the old digitization stuff was coming around, and it was starting to really add into the genre. But then you get something like this, which was pure 2D. And you had the NFL Blitz, which was like a classic arcade. But like this was the era where you started to see the final rundown, like the final end game as it approached. And I think a lot of people, recognize that this was that last stand, the last era for the 2D games and for the arcades. This is where they came to their end. And whether you think that was a good or a bad thing, like this was the time when it all came crumbling down. And like here's another short little thing. Both of these were released in the early 90s because the TurboGrafx CD was one of the first CD units to market, but because it was such new technology, the Sega CD was right there next to it, and this was a re-release. It was 1993, so it was running right beside it alongside the Genesis. A lot of the Genesis stuff was end of 80s, early 90s, all the way through to 1995, which was Vector Man and the six pack. So you can tell that there was a lot of really interesting stuff happening here. That unfortunately, like the gaming industry was kind of at its most creative, but also and experimental, but also its least stable. At least at the time, I'd say now is actually the time it is least stable. But that's personal opinion, of course. But yeah, like this game and this game came out in the same year and are miles apart from each other. This game and this game came out a year apart, and they were very different. This game, same year. These two games a couple of years apart. Although this was a repackage. But all of these are examples of the era coming to its close. And it's one of those things that both, on one hand, a part of me feels a sadness watching these eras come to an end. Like here's the era of the 2D, where the 2D was king, and now it's coming to a close. This is the CD was king in the 90s, as you can see from all these, and then nowadays digital is the master of the universe. It is what it is. MechWarrior 2. God, I wish they would re-release this with modern control support, because this game on PC was an absolute champion. On the PlayStation, it's joke. It is such a inferior product. I only have it because I got it for like 2 cents. It was like pennies on the dollar. In another arcade port. Early racing game. Taifu was a martial arts platformer. Now Tiger Shark is a game I remember being super hard, but very fun. But I cannot play it now. It just kicks my ass. The WWE games. All of this was the era of the 90s era of insanity. The Warzone, and the In Your House, the arcade game, the Smackdowns. But I very much feel like these were the eras in which gaming was at its most unique and experimental, but also its least stable and least consistent in quality, I should say. I still feel like there's a lot of good stuff in this era, but I wouldn't say that it's all gold. No, it never is. Still, for collectors, this is the era that many of us are fond of because it is an era where the gaming industry was so expensive. Between the early 80s and 2000s, the gaming industry saw more progress technologically and in terms of what was accepted in the gaming space than ever imagined. I mean, seriously, you went from Nintendo, which all of this was all of this was the late '80s, was Nintendo's era, and like 1985, Kid Icarus, Mach Rider, and Metroid were all in the same space. And these all came out in the same time frame. And then the last game I know of from that era in my collection, I think, and see, like these are new. These were made using new technology. But the last game I remember being in my setup of collections was, I think, Gyrus and Star Tropics are the most recent. Yeah. But then you went from that to the Super Nintendo. 1992, 1993, 1993. A lot of 93s. 94, 96. And then you go to the PlayStation era, or the Genesis era, it's all the same time frame as the Nintendo and Super Nintendo, because the Genesis rushed to market to get to to beat the Super Nintendo to the market. The Saturn would be later, 1995. It was the early attempt in Japan to get the Saturn out to beat the Nintendo console that was scheduled to be coming out, and it would eventually get overshadowed by the PlayStation. Then you have the PlayStation, which came out right around 1995 as well. All of these within the same time frame. Like Air Comet's one of the earliest games I remember for the platform. Came out in 1995. So you're talking all of these hit in the same time zone, and all of them had vastly different systems and hardware. It's quite stunning. And to this day, like many of these games are still playable, still fun, still enjoyable. The Super Nintendo, of course, masterclass in gaming design. But I tell people all the time, like don't look down on old games. They had their time and they were something to be proud of back in the day, but I'll be the first to admit, yeah, the era is over. Doesn't mean I don't want it to be preserved. That's why I feel like preservation is so important, because see, here's the two different versions of Victory Run. This is the one that was released in America, this is the one that was released in Japan. And you can tell which ones are which based on their marker. But that's the thing, like all of these are the product of their era. And in many ways, they are the results of the gaming industry rushing to try and push itself to its limits. And then I think with the era of the PlayStation 2, the Xbox 360, and then the GameCube, the industry slowed down and started really reconsidering where it was going to stand. Still, it gave us gems like Evil Zone, and I will never ever not be thankful for Evil Zone, because seriously, Evil Zone is such a absolute just madhouse of silliness. Yeah, Evil Zone was one of those games that came to me by accident. Like I rented it from a store. Oh yeah, Errol. I rented it from a store, and got my hands on it almost by accident because I just love the design of the artwork. And then I played it and I was just blown away. But and I'll show the English version, which is hilariously badly translated and designed. It's like the game is almost identical with some minor censorship, especially to her. She actually wears leggings in the English version, so you don't get to see her proper dump truck of a rear. But what's also hilarious about is she actually has a costume you can play as in the multiplayer mode where it looks like she's naked. Like they just straight out make her look naked. Which I don't know, like Japan was like, fuck it, we're going this game's an entire giant shitpost to begin with. So let's just run with it. And I love how she actually clones herself and plays baseball with you. And then the baseball drops on the clone and destroys it. Like the game's sense of humor is so clear and so obvious. But the entire joke about her is she's doing a dating show for her storyline. It is hysterical. Like, and this is something that did translate over to the English version. If you play the English version, which they both have really good artwork, I'm not going to lie. But this game was censored and this one was not, which is why I prefer it. And the censored version, unfortunately, is like, yeah, I've got a virtual memory card on this. But like the censored version was actually vastly inferior. But like this is all similar games from the same group. But like they're all fighting. These are all similar games, fighting games. Ooh, I forgot about this Battlemaster. I don't know if he's even wearing clothes in that image. Okay, but like they actually did release. It's actually based on an old super. I think it's based on like an old Super Famicom game, but like the whole running gag with this is that this is part of Yuke's output, and Yuke's was known for their wrestling series, including their Simple 2000 series, in affiliation with the publisher D3. But they were more known for their wrestling series, and that was made at the time, and that was like their big thing was wrestling. But then they did this thing, and it's like, the hell is this nonsense? But I love it. But this is an era in which the gaming industry saw so much change and so much chaos. But I love it. And all things being equal, I think if you're a collector, especially for retro games, the fact that the Polymega explicitly focuses on that 20-year period makes it the perfect collecting system. I still think that they should add a few of the more modern stuff. In particular, I think the GameCube and maybe some of the more esoteric game platforms like the 3DO could be added. But I do think like it's still worth the time if you're interested in the series. And it gives you, if you get your chance to get like rare stuff like Elemental Gearbolt, which, holy crap, this game was weird. I still have no idea about the story myself. I'm still trying to figure that out, but it's a rare opportunity to get some of the best, weirdest, most fun games ever seen. And I especially recommend like importing what you can from Japan. A lot of them will have their menus in English, so it's okay, but I definitely recommend it. But yeah, it's just good stuff overall. Either way, The Genesis collection continues apace, but my next acquisition will be the Crusader No Remorse for the PS1, simply because at a practical level, it's the best performing version of that game I've ever seen. Even the PC version, unless you play mouse and keyboard, is very hard to play. So, anyway, I will catch you all later. Solo Gamer signing out. Hope to see you all soon. Take care.